to be showing you how to do a full bust adjustment on the adult Onyx pattern. This is a princess seamed blazer, so the adjustment is a little bit different than a standard adult bodice would be. So the first thing I've done is gone ahead and traced out, including my pattern markings, my pieces. Now I normally use a projector, so I've traced this onto paper so that it's easier for me to make my adjustments. You can also just use the print pieces. I've also gone ahead and done my calculations for how much of a full bust adjustment I'm going to need. So in my case, my upper bust measures 32.5 inches, which is a size 4. My full bust is 36.5. That gives me a difference of 4 inches. Now the Boo and Lou patterns are drafted for a 2-inch difference between the upper bust and the full bust. So I need to count for an additional 2 inches of my full bust. For a full bust adjustment, we actually divide the additional 2 inches by 2. So we get a total of a 1-inch full bust adjustment. So that's 0.5 inches added for every 1 inch of difference above and beyond the 2-inch difference the pattern is drafted for. I've also traced my pattern pieces onto another piece of paper, or 2 pieces of paper in this case, because when I'm finished with my adjustments, I want to overlay them on this or cut these out and overlay this piece on my new pieces to make sure that I haven't made any changes to the waistlines. Now, if I have, I can then use these pieces to retrace those waistlines. The other thing I want to mention here is, for me personally, I also need to do a full bicep adjustment. These particular pieces I've already adjusted for the full bicep, and you can see our video on that as well. So I do recommend doing the bicep adjustment if you need to do that as well as your full bust adjustment prior to doing your full bust adjustment. Your first step is going to be to draw in your seam allowances. I've drawn it on the center front, but you don't actually really need to do that. You really need it on the side front piece. So I've used my 3/8 inch seam allowance all along this front seam here and along the arm side here. We don't need it anyplace else. The next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to move my center front out of the way and I'm going to work on my side front piece. I am first going to find the apex of this piece. So that's going to be the point that sticks out the farthest. So in this case, my apex is about right here. So I am going to draw a straight line. It helps if you can use a cutting mat to line up the bottom of your bodice piece, because that is a straight line that goes across here, so that I can ensure that I am making a straight line that goes all the way across. So that's my bust apex there, and I'm going to draw a line that goes straight across there. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a straight line from this point here, which is my bust apex seam allowance point, and I'm going to draw a line straight down to the bottom here, which is the bottom of my seam allowance on that particular seam. And it won't be curved like the seam allowances. That's okay. The third line I'm going to draw is from this bust apex point here all the way up to about halfway, a third to halfway on my side front piece on the arm side. So I'm going to draw the line straight up there. So now we have these 3 lines. I am then going to cut along these lines as follows. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut from this bottom point up to this point here, and from this point up into my seam allowance point here. I'm then going to cut from this point here to my seam allowance point here. I want to make sure I leave a little bit of material here so that I can create a pivot point. I am now going to cut from this point here almost all the way to this point here. So again, we're going to leave a little bit of material there so that we have another pivot point. All right. So now we have a hinge here and a hinge here. Now that these are all cut and hinged, I'm going to place a piece of paper underneath the area that I'm working in. I am going to take my piece, and along the side here, I'm going to tape this edge in place. Now I'm going to make sure that my edge is flush against this bottom edge because it'll make my next step a little bit easier. And I'm going to tape that down. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure on this piece of paper here the adjustment that I'm making. Once again, my adjustment is a 1-inch adjustment. So using my ruler, I'm going to make my 1-inch markings along this straight edge here. So those are my 1-inch markings, and that's because that's my bust adjustment that I'm making. Now that I've marked my 1-inch space for my full bust adjustment, I'm then going to take this piece and I'm going to make sure that this is parallel all the way along here using this marking as a guideline and tape that piece in place. So I have an even 1 inch that goes from the top of my bust all the way down to the bottom here, and I'm going to tape that in place just like that. The next thing we want to do is actually bring this bottom piece down now so that it's even with this bottom piece here. So I'm just going to cut this off. I'm going to pull it down, straight down, and again I can use those markings as a guideline, and I'm going to tape that in place. I now want to measure the distance that I increased this piece here at the front. So I'm just going to use my ruler and I'm going to measure. So on mine is 1 1/8 inch that I've added from this point to this point when I dropped this piece down. And I'm just going to make note of that, 1 1/8 inch. For the next step, I need to have the piece cut out. So I'm going to go ahead and place another piece underneath this piece, just in this area here, and tape this in place so that I can trace my piece out, including this dart that we've opened up here. All right, now we have this piece. We're not done yet, but now we have this piece with our adjusted side and this open dart here. So my next step is just along this bottom line here. I am going to draw a straight line that goes all the way across to my seam allowance. Again, you're just following that bottom line of the dart that you just made. We're then going to cut along this line all the way through to the seam allowance and actually all the way to the end. So we now have 2 pieces. Now carefully what we're going to do is we want to close this dart that's here. So we're going to bring this piece up, and I'm just going to hold it where that pivot point on the dart is, because I want to close that dart just like that and create a new gap on this side here. Once again, this was like this. We're holding it just here, pushing it up there, and creating an opening on this side. And we're just going to tape this shut. Now, this is our new piece. What we will have is just to have to close this gap here. So if you'd like to, you can tape this down and just blend this curve in like this. And this is our new side front piece here with our additional area that we need for our bust. For the next steps, we're going to need to know what this distance here is that we've just created. So I'm just going to take my ruler, you can use a measuring tape, and I'm going to measure how big of a gap that is, and mine is reading 1/2 inch. So we have the 1 1/8 inch from this measurement down here, and we have the 1/2 of an inch in my case in this area here. So now that we have that adjusted, we need to make the adjustments to our center front piece because this is the piece that goes along here. So we've increased the length here and we've increased the length here. So we need to do the same to the center front piece of our Onyx blazer. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the distance from the bottom of my pattern piece up until where I made this gap here. So in my case, mine's 1 1/4 inch. I'm going to make the same marking 1 1/4 inch from the bottom of my pattern piece, which is right here. Okay, so that is 1 1/4 inch, which is the same distance here. I'm then, don't measure this gap here, I'm then going to make another measurement that is at my bust apex point here, down to where I split this piece here. So again, we're ignoring this gap right now. So that, for me, is measuring 5 1/2 inch. So from this point here that I marked, I'm going to measure up 5 1/2 inch. So again, these match here and these match here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line straight across here and straight across here. Whoops. And I'm going to go ahead and cut along those lines. Now we have two different gaps. So in the top gap, we're going to add the 1/2 inch. Again, this was the 1/2 inch gap. And this one here is the 1 1/8 inch gap. So we're going to add 1/2 inch here, and we're going to add 1 1/8 inch down here. So again, I'm just going to grab a piece of paper. I am going to go ahead and tape this in place. Measure down my 1/2 inch. And again, I like to create guidelines to make sure I am even. And I am going to put this here. And once again down here. So I'm going to put another piece of paper here. Tape it. Whoops. And this is my 1 1/8 inch down here. So 1 1/8. And then we're once again going to cut along these lines here. Just like that. Now, because we adjusted this center front piece, you're also going to need to adjust your facing. So your facing, you're going to split it in the exact same places. We're going to go through the same steps of measuring up to this point here, adding the 1 1/8 inch, adding up to this point here, adding the 1/2 inch. And again, these will be your own measurements. These are just mine for the example. And you'll extend your facing piece the same exact way. So your facing and your interface facing piece. So as I mentioned before, you're going to want to have your original pattern piece prior to making the full bust adjustment handy. This is because when we created this extra room here for our bust, we also inadvertently increased the width of the waist, which we don't want to do. So for this particular example, I've been using the crop piece to show you. This will also be exactly the same for the peplum version, the tulip bottom version, and also the hip flounce version. If you're making the hip length version, your piece will end up being a lot longer than this, which is not an issue at all. You can either, for this adjustment, cut it off and reblend it into the bottom of that piece. Obviously cutting as one piece the fabric. Don't cut your fabric in two pieces. Or you can leave your pattern piece as a whole and just do these next steps that I'm about to do with the full hip length to make sure that you haven't increased your waist or hip measurements on your pattern piece. So this is, I've gone ahead and cut out my original one. Again, this is after doing any other adjustments that I needed to do. And I am going to place this on top. So you can see here that if we put this here, obviously in the bust area, it's going to be different. But in the waist area, we don't want it to be any different. Otherwise, we're adding an inch to our width there. So I'm going to take this pattern piece here, and you can see that this is the same distance here. So we're going to push this all the way to the left here so that those points there are meeting. When we adjust this, we want to adjust it below where we close this dart here, and I would actually go down maybe 1 or 2 inches from this point. So I'm going to put this piece here, and I am going to, for the ease of this, you can do this, you can cut directly, but for the ease of this, just so you guys can see what I'm doing, I'm going to go ahead and trace this pattern piece onto here. Okay? So this is my tracing line that I want to get to. So again, we're going to go a little bit under where this dart was closed, and I'm just going to take this and I'm going to blend it in to where the waistline is, and then all the way down. So where this comes in here, again, we're just going to take it down, and you can do this a little bit more gradually if you want, just to kind of blend that down. And then we're going to cut that off. All right. And there we have our new pattern pieces with our full bust adjustment, keeping our waist measurements or hip measurements if you're doing the full version the same. I hope that helps. Thanks everyone.